When a villain crashes out, they lose everything in the most unforgettable way possible. Tai Lung snaps over rejection and levels a village. Lotso clings to power and gets thrown in the trash, while Kingpin causes a multiverse crisis trying to change his past. These are the villains who go out in flames, not because the hero stops them, but mostly because they can't stop themselves. So why do some crash-outs feel legendary while others just feel loud? The answer lies in knowing what a crash-out is in the first place. If you've ever felt that strange satisfaction watching a villain lose everything, you've experienced their crash-out. It's a moment of emotional collapse that leads directly to self-destruction. It's when a character's loss of control, driven by their deepest flaw or obsession, brings about their poetic end. And the first, most satisfying way to write this is through one built on rejection, especially when it comes with identity. This type of villain explosion is justifiable to most people because they have witnessed the villain being told that they will never be who they thought they were meant to be. That's what makes Tai Lung's story so powerful. His entire life was built on a promise that he was special, destined, and chosen. Shifu found him as an abandoned cub and raised him like a son. When he showed talent, Shifu told him he was destined for greatness. He told him that he would be the Dragon Warrior, and Tai Lung built his entire personality and motivation around this identity. But here's the thing. Identity built on someone else's validation is fragile, and one rejection can turn it into dust. So when Master Oogway denied Tai Lung the Dragon Scroll, his sense of self collapsed. This led to his initial crash out, where he laid waste to the valley and attempted to take the scroll by force, but Oogway stopped him. Tai Lung is one of the few villains that has 3 major crash outs in one movie, and all were epic. The second would come 20 years after his imprisonment. You know this one has to be epic because it took 2 decades to develop. He could have snapped at the prison guard who stepped on his tail and mocked him while he was still chained, but he saved his rage for Shifu because Shifu was the one who made and unmade him. Therefore, his prison escape and his fight with the Furious Five had no malicious intent. He was just fighting through obstacles, delaying him from reaching his real target. This target.
I have come home, Master.
The battle that follows is the climax of his emotional collapse, a physical manifestation of his internal conflict. It is also what is probably the greatest crash out in animation history. It started with what seemed like Tai Lung was an earthbender, hinting at just how crazy the sequence was going to be. Then, the conversations that occur mid-fight are emotional because they are like a child demanding an explanation from a neglectful parent.
Who filled my head with dreams? Who drove me to train until my bones cracked? Denied me my destiny!
Then there's the score and sound effect mixing up nicely with every kick and punch to create something that can only be described as peak cinema. But let's not forget when Tai Lung broke Oogway's staff, or better yet, when he and Shifu crashed through the roof. The thunder and lightning that followed seemed to punctuate the greatness of the scene. But perhaps the best part was this.
What I ever did, I did to make you proud!
And the real emotional climax comes when Shifu finally offers the only thing he can, a sincere, painful apology. For a moment, Tai Lung hesitates, the narcissist seeing a flicker of the love he craves, but the rejection runs too deep. So he declines the apology because the scroll is the only thing he wants now. He chooses his manufactured identity over actual reconciliation, and thus sealed his fate. This brings us to his final, most poetic crash out when he confronts Po and finally opens the Dragon Scroll, only to find it's nothing. This is the total, absolute annihilation of his identity. He He had murdered and sacrificed everything for a title that turns out to be empty, revealing only his reflection, which is the truth Shifu wanted him to find out for himself. His subsequent assault on Po is pure, desperate frustration. He strikes the nerve points repeatedly, but because Po is a big fat panda, like Tai Lung called him, the legendary attack is useless, adding insult to existential injury. Tai Lung is ultimately defeated by the cosmic joke of his own obsession. Now, compare this perfect character arc to the failure of Hans from Frozen. On paper, he should have worked. Like Tai Lung, Hans is another villain driven by rejection and false identity. He is the 13th son of his family, born with no chance at a throne. Hence, he is desperate to claim worth by marrying into power. The setup is solid, but the execution misses the mark. Instead of spiraling out of control, Hans just performs. And rather than confronting the source of his rejection, his family, or showing genuine internal conflict, he simply manipulates, using a mask of charisma throughout the film. Every scene before his reveal shows him as kind and attentive, but not conflicted. There's no glimpse of bitterness, no crack in the mask, and nothing that hints at insecurity or suppressed rage. So, when he suddenly reveals himself as a sociopath, it feels less like a crash out and more like a costume change. Basically, his character is a twist villain, designed to surprise the audience, not to explore a genuine psychological descent. His fall is even more terrible because it is anticlimactic. He's easily disposed of by Anna's punch and then shipped off. There is no poetic justice, no reflection of his flaw in his fate, and no emotional cost because the audience never saw him as anything other than the charming prince until the twist. And that was the problem. If the villain's true identity is only revealed in the final acts, their crash out will feel like a cheap plot device, rather than a character's tragic consequence. But beyond rejection-driven meltdowns, there's another kind of villain crash out that writers rarely use. However, when it works, the effects are insane. This method basically uses obsession and the loss of control to establish a perfect villain crash out. This is where a villain's need for order, security, or power is so absolute that when it's challenged, they annihilate themselves. They become so obsessed with maintaining their creation that they destroy the very thing they built. But here's the tricky part: obsession alone isn't enough. You see, the villain must be destroyed by their reason for obsession, rather than just the loss of their power. This is why King Magnifico's crash out following the threat to his control and the eventual loss did not land. The narrative fails by treating him as a monster when his motivations are fundamentally rooted in a very human psychological trauma. His crash out makes sense for a man under extreme pressure, but it doesn't work for a villain because the story forces his villainy on him. Magnifico's backstory explains his initial benevolence. He built Rosas to be a kingdom where people never have to experience the pain of a crushed dream or the stress of failure. His system of taking wishes to safekeep them is a direct manifestation of this pathology, a desperate, misguided attempt to shield everyone from the pain he once suffered. Because of this, he believes he should decide what everyone deserves.
I decide what everyone deserves.
Okay, that might seem like the initial crash out of a very terrible villain, but if we are being honest, it kinda makes sense that he would react in that manner. This is because the people of Rosas do not appear to be burdened by anything. They are not hungry, they don't pay rent, and their kingdom is beautiful, yet they still feel an unreasonable degree of entitlement. We see this through Asha, who, despite aspiring to be his apprentice, immediately asks for a personal favor for her grandfather. And you can tell that this hurt the king.
You know, most people wait a few months, even a year, before they start asking me
for things.
I'm so sorry.
Anybody would have been mad too if they were in Magnifico's shoes. You also see him flip out during his address to the people of Rosas. The dude was trying to tell his people that there was a traitor amongst them, and he or she needed to be exposed. But they went from concerned to demanding once again.
Is that all you can think about? A wish-granting ceremony?
This wish-granting ceremony is also another way the story shoots itself in the foot. It is done in public, and everyone who gives up their wish is obviously seen to have forgotten it. Yet, through Asha, the movie tries to convince us that they were not aware of the consequences all this time. It's like signing up to a new app whose terms and conditions you read and accept. Then, when one entitled dummy protests one of the rules, you suddenly decide that you want to protest too. But now, you expect the owners of the app not to be pissed? Anyone would lash out if they felt they were helping a bunch of ungrateful people only to be betrayed. Seriously? Is this really the thanks King Magnifico gets? In summary, his Crashout is undermined because his evil and the entire story around it make little sense. If the villain's obsession feels justified by the circumstances, their self-destruction will feel like a reasonable reaction, rather than a tragic flaw. So, how do you write the perfect Crashout resulting from control and obsession? Just look at Lotso Huggenbear, a villain whose explosion is devastating because his obsession with control is rooted in a far more specific and devastating trauma: abandonment. Lotso experienced the pure existential pain of being replaced after being lost by his kid, Daisy. That rejection shattered his entire worldview, causing him to develop a malignant narcissistic defense mechanism, resulting in his first Crashout.
She replaced us. Come on.
No, she only replaced you.
She replaced all of us, didn't she?
Therefore, to not feel powerless or unwanted again, he decides to control and dictate his connections. His rule over Sunnyside Daycare is really just emotional insurance. If he controls everyone, he can never be abandoned again. But this is where it gets really interesting. Lotso's ultimate Crashout during the dumpster scene is a terrifying psychological collapse. When the toys are trying to escape, he attempts to break Woody's spirit.
You think you're special, cowboy? You're a piece of plastic. You were made to be thrown away.
This is projection at its darkest. Lotso isn't talking about Woody, but himself. And when Woody finally confronts him with the truth that Daisy simply lost them, but replaced Lotso specifically, the dam breaks. Lotso has spent years living a lie to avoid this truth, and the exposure sends him into a violent frenzy. The key piece of evidence is Big Baby's pendant with Daisy's name. Woody uses this to point out to Big Baby that Lotso has been lying all this time, and with that, Lotso is consumed by rage.
What? You want your mommy back?
Never loved you. Don't be set up, baby.
Destroying that pendant is a moment of genuine poetic Crashout. He is literally destroying the only thing he ever truly wanted: proof of love. Lotso's violent act against Big Baby, slamming his cane into his stomach and declaring that all toys are trash, is the final ultimate surrender to his worldview. His obsession with control leads him to a point of such violent cruelty that he alienates the one toy who truly understood his pain, resulting in him being trapped in the very fate he desperately tried to force on others. That is, becoming actual trash. His collapse is earned because it stems directly from the trauma he refused to heal, making his obsession the engine of his destruction. Kingpin from Into the Spider-Verse also represents the ultimate escalation of control and obsession. He is a wealthy villain attempting to manipulate the laws of the universe to reverse a single unbearable moment of loss. Kingpin's entire Super Collider project is a pathological manifestation of his grief after his wife and son died. He seeks control over space and time to retrieve alternate versions of his family, believing that if he can get them again, he can restore his identity and purpose. This goal elevates his villainy beyond simple greed. It's an existential obsession driven by profound psychological denial, just like Lotso. His initial violent crash out, which is the murder of Peter Parker, is directly triggered when he's confronted with the truth of his delusion.
I know what you're trying to do, and it won't work.
This shatters Kingpin's carefully constructed reality, transforming the controlled, cold rage into a frenzy. The crash out was so intense that it ended the life of Spider-Man. That was pure madness, and it added to the entire stakes, resulting in a final crash out that led to a dramatic ending. When Miles Morales and the other Spider guys messed up his collider, it was the ultimate rejection of his control.
Quantum polarity has been reversed.
He is that pissed because he had sacrificed so much to reach that point. But worse, he believed himself unstoppable. You can't kill a legendary hero and not feel like a god, can you? But unfortunately, a little kid was pissing on his plans. His crash out and eventual death are the dramatic payoff for a character who sacrificed the entire world for a single selfish obsession. But because you cannot always write villains who are driven by rejection or obsessed with control, here's another powerful way you can write a villain crash out. The only issue is some people might be pissed with this type of meltdown, especially when it is poorly written. This method focuses on villains who are driven by an obsessive pathological need for public applause, recognition, or fame. They want to be loved or be the star, and their crash out is precipitated when that carefully constructed image is threatened, usually by the hero. To see how this is done perfectly and how it can go catastrophically wrong, we look at the musician Ernesto de la Cruz from Coco and the mommy's boy Prince Charming from Shrek the Third. Both men are defined by desperate, insatiable thirst for public adoration. Yet Ernesto's downfall is legendary, and Charming's is just a forgettable joke. But why is this the case? Well, it comes down to stakes, psychology, and the fundamental difference between an emotional breakdown and a pathetic tantrum. Ernesto's crash out happens in phases, and the first one establishes the true, rotten foundation of his fame. When Hector decides to leave music and return home to his family, Ernesto loses it.
Can't do this without your songs, Hector. Going home, Ernesto.
He knows his talent is limited, and Hector's departure means the end of his dream. Therefore, realizing there was nothing he could do to convince his friend, he decided to poison him and steal his songs. This goes to show just how far he is willing to go to do whatever it takes to seize his moment. And this is all because of his ego and the image he so desperately wants to build and maintain. But even before this crash out, the film does something brilliant, something that made it heavier. You see, the story makes you love Ernesto through the eyes of Miguel, the protagonist, as we root for the boy to achieve his musical dreams and hopefully meet his idol. We develop a connection with Ernesto as well. Therefore, when the first crash out comes, it lands perfectly because of that emotional connection or stake already established with the audience. We've been liking the dude until that scene with Hector. Remember we said earlier that a villain's crash out is a moment of emotional collapse that leads directly to self-destruction? Well, Ernesto's destruction would come later, but that poisoning gives us a glimpse of what his ultimate crash out would look like. Shrek the Third also attempts this initial emotional explosion with Prince Charming. His own comes at the start of the movie, following his humiliation during his stage play.
Do you mind?
When the audience laughs him off stage, he is pissed, walks out, and cries in front of a broken mirror. This breakdown is pathetic, especially for a villain. We see he is a grown man, emotionally stunted and desperately clinging to the approval of his dead mother. Charming has an ego, we get it. But unlike Ernesto's, it's not tied to any compelling internal stakes. It's just generalized entitlement and mommy issues. But what's worse, the film doesn't even make us like him enough to care. While it is possible that Charming was intentionally written to be unlikable for comedic effect, that unlikability makes his Crashout meaningless from a writing perspective. The audience already hates him, so when he falls, we feel no release, no poetic justice, only the relief that the joke is over. If the audience doesn't care about the villain's rise, they won't care about the fall. That is why Ernesto's final Crashout is a masterpiece. Miguel's family's infiltration of his concert is like the world catching up to his lie. Every line in this scene peels away another layer of delusion.
You think I'd let him go back to the land of the living, Porto? To keep your memory alive?
The fact that he is willing to murder a kid just to preserve his image crowns him as a villain with a perfect Crashout. And then comes the exposure, the one that destroys him for good. Thankfully, it happens on the biggest possible platform, weaponizing the very thing Ernesto craved: recognition. He tries to dismiss it as a joke, but his mask is torn off, and his true cowardly self is exposed to the world. He makes a final desperate appeal to his audience, calling them Mi Familia, a pathetic attempt to weaponize the fake intimacy he had always sold them. But it's too late. The emotional weight of the scene is devastating, because we, the audience, know he murdered for that moment, and now that moment is being used to destroy him. When the conductor breaks his baton in half, a powerful nonverbal rejection, and the audience begins to pelt him with food, his humiliation is total. The very people who made him a god are casting him down. Charming's final Crashout also happens on stage, but he wasn't really exposed because the audience at home and those in the movie have always disliked him. However, another thing that ruined his Crashout was his lack of focused motivation. His initial purpose was to seize the throne and avenge his mother's death. Yet after successfully taking the throne, he immediately reverts to setting up a stage play because his deepest need isn't power or revenge, but applause. Therefore, when he finally lost, it felt like the end of a comedy show.
Comedy?
The psychological reason this fails is that Prince Charming suffers from no internal conflict worth caring about. He is 100% surface-level vanity. He never had to make a difficult choice like murdering a friend, just like Ernesto. Mind you, Ernesto also had to live with the secret of his crime, forcing him to keep a larger-than-life persona that demanded increasingly reckless behavior to maintain. And that's the key right there. A successful Crashout requires a heavy moral debt to be repaid, and Charming's debt was never high enough. But you're probably thinking, okay, that was fun. However, how do I really write my own perfect villain Crashout? Can't I have like a checklist or something? Well, you absolutely can, and don't worry, we've got you covered. Writing the perfect villain Crashout requires you to engineer a moment of poetic self-destruction, ensuring the villain is consumed by the very flaw that defined their rise, rather than simply being defeated by the hero. This process can be broken down into 3 crucial steps, all rooted in established profound internal conflict and paying off the narrative's emotional debt. The first step is to establish the core destructive flaw. This flaw must be more than just a desire for power, but an existential obsession stemming from a deep-seated psychological wound. For Lotso, the flaw was obsessive control born from the trauma of abandonment, and for Tai Lung, it was a narcissistic identity fused with a single title, driven by the need for validation from Shifu. Conversely, villains like King Magnifico and Hans fail here because their motivations are either plot-driven and generic, or a last-minute exposition dump. The problem with this is that it offers no genuine psychological depth for the audience to invest in. Look, if you're still confused, just ask yourself, what is the emotional wound that makes your villain need to be this way? But ensure the answer you come up with is reasonable. Anyway, the second step is the earned escalation and exposure. That is, the villain must make a series of escalating choices that actively lead to their downfall, ensuring their destruction is a self-inflicted wound. This descent must be public and dramatic, weaponizing the villain's greatest source of pride against them. Ernesto de la Cruz is the prime example, where his crimes, murder, and theft are revealed on the largest stage possible, turning his moment of ultimate desired glory into the moment of ultimate humiliation. He is destroyed by the very thing he sought: audience validation. This phase contrasts sharply with failures like Prince Charming, whose emotional breakdown is merely a pathetic tantrum in front of a puppet theater, lacking any real menace or emotional cost. Finally, the third step is the ironic annihilation. The Crashout must conclude with a poetic, specific, and terminal consequence directly related to the villain's flaw. This creates a satisfying, earned emotional weight. Lotso is thrown into the trash and eventually tied to the front of a truck. This was the ultimate symbol of the worthlessness he projected onto others, while Tai Lung is destroyed by the nothingness of the Dragon Scroll, proving his life's dedication to an external identity was useless. The final moment of cosmic justice is what elevates the Crashout from a simple defeat to a legendary downfall. The crazy thing is, many of these villains who fail at their Crashout are part of the reasons why modern villains suck. This video just confirmed that, so go check it out.